Hello, everyone. Welcome to Inconvenient Truths. I'm your host, Jennifer Zheng. By next year, China could face a staggering situation with up to 120 million people at risk of starvation. This alarming conclusion was reached by Chinese economists who analyzed China's unemployment rate using official statistics but applied his own methodology. I've reviewed his calculations and found them to be both solid and rational. Today, I want to walk you through his process so you can understand why this conclusion seems reasonable. While the math might be a bit dry, the findings are crucial. So please bear with me for a while as I believe this information is important. Now, let's take a detailed step-by-step look at how the economist Lao Man arrived at this conclusion. Most of the calculations were conducted by him, with a few completed by myself. First, let's look at the employment data published by China's National Bureau of Statistics. This is official data in Chinese. Translated into English, it reads, in 2022, the urban employed population was 459.31 million. The rural employed population was about 274 million, totaling 733.51 million. Additionally, official data states that as of the end of 2022, China's urban surveyed unemployment rate was 5.5%. It's widely believed that this unemployment figure is highly unreliable. Firstly, what does surveyed unemployment rate mean? It means that officially designated surveyors visit urban and rural households nationwide, including dormitories in factories and enterprises, as well as dormitories and shacks where migrant workers might gather. They then ask if anyone there is unemployed. This method of survey is absurd, just like asking passengers on a moving train if they were able to buy a ticket, right? Another astonishing aspect is that the National Bureau of Statistics considers even working 1 hour per week as employment. For example, someone who does a 1 hour live broadcast on Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, and earns only 50 cents is considered fully employed by the official standards. So the official so-called surveyed unemployment rate is like a joke, utterly untrustworthy. Therefore, we must calculate based on other data. Let's first calculate the total number of working-age laborers. In 2022, China's total population was about 1.4 billion. According to data from the Ministry of Public Security, the urban population ratio is about 47.7%. Based on this ratio, the urban population can be calculated as 1.4 million times 47.7% equals 673.4 million people. The rural population is 1.4 billion minus 374 million. That is about 738 million people. At this point, I must explain that in China, everyone has a so-called household registration or 户口. If you are born in a city and registered there, you are considered an urban household population. If you are born in the countryside or born in the city, but your parents are registered in the rural population, you are considered a rural household population. Even if you work or move to a city, unless you obtained a city hukou quota and changed your registration to a city hukou, you are always considered a rural hukou. Since the CCP's establishment, this household registration system has divided people into two major classes, urban and rural populations, and for many years it restricted the free movement of people. Before the so-called reform and opening up, if you went to an unfamiliar city without a hukou, it was very difficult to survive, as all living supplies were allocated based on hukou quotas, such as how many kilograms of rice or pork you could buy per month. People without a hukou couldn't buy this at all, even if they had the money. Therefore, at that time, people could not move freely between cities or between cities and rural areas. Now let's return to the calculation of the unemployment rate. Another important point is that for rural and urban household registrations, the CCP uses different criteria to determine the employed population. For those with a rural hukou, as soon as they turn 15 years old, the government considers them adults. If they don't continue their studies, they are deemed part of the labor force and are never considered unemployed until they die. Chinese farmers are never unemployed because the government believes they can always farm at home, so there's never an unemployment issue. This is also why the CCP only calculates the urban surveyed unemployment rate and not the rural surveyed unemployment rate. However, in reality, there isn't enough land for all farmers, so the surplus labor force has to go to the cities to work. Now let's calculate the theoretical total number of employed people in rural areas. This should be the total rural population minus the population aged 14 and below, and those in high school and above. According to the 2020 population census, the proportion of rural residents aged 14 and below is about 19%. So the total number should be about 142 million. According to the data from the Ministry of Education, the number of students in rural areas in high school and above accounts to 5.72% of the total population. So their number is about 42.23 million. Therefore, the total number of rural adult labor force should be, I want to read out the formula. Please look at it on the screen. The result is 553.84 million. This is Laoman's calculation. Now let's look at the related official data. The number of employed people in rural areas in 2022 is 274.2 million, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. This is the number of laborers recognized as still working in agriculture in rural areas. According to the 22 Rural Migrant Worker Monitoring Survey report published by the National Bureau of Statistics, the total number of rural migrant workers in cities is 295.62 million. And in these two figures together gives us 569.8 million. This is very close to Laoman's calculation. So why can't rural areas accommodate so many laborers, and why do nearly 300 million of them need to leave their homes and work in cities as migrant workers? According to data from the Ministry of Land and Resources, China currently has a total of 2.22 billion mu of arable land. Mu is a Chinese unit for the area. 1 mu is about 0.0667 hectares. So 2.22 billion mu is about 147.7 million hectares. However, in China, after deducting various expenses, 1 mu of land can only yield a profit of 1,000 yuan per year, but the cost of living for a person is at least 10,000 yuan. This means that every 10 mu of land can barely support one person. So 2.22 billion mu of land can only support a rural population of about 200 million. That's why nearly 300 million people must go out to work and send money back home to barely sustain a living. China's rural resident population is 491.04 million, but the land can only support 200 million people. This means that for the 290 million people living in rural areas, they must rely on the money sent by those working outside. Currently, the number of people working in cities is around 290 million. In other words, every migrant worker supports one person back in the rural area. Without these workers, the 290 million people in rural areas would have starved to death long ago. It is also worth mentioning that in rural areas, farmers basically have no government welfare and rely solely on family support and relief. This leads to a very cruel reality. If one migrant worker loses his or her job in the city and can only return to the rural area, the land there cannot sustain him or her. The person who was previously supported by this worker will also starve to death. In other words, for every lost job of a migrant worker, 2 people in rural areas will starve to death. This is the cruel reality. Now, let's look at the urban situation. Since official figures are unreliable, we have to calculate it ourselves. First, we also need to calculate the working age labor force of the urban hukou population. Considering the concept of retirement in urban hukou population, the formula for calculating the urban working age labor force and the result are 673 million total urban hukou population minus 190 million minors minus 38 million high school and above students minus 107 million retirees over 60. That is 409 million. However, according to the National Bureau of Statistics, the urban employed population in 2022 is 459 million, which is about 50 million more than the working age labor force we calculated. Why is that? This is because the 459 million urban employed population actually includes 296 million rural migrant workers. Subtracting these 296 million, the urban employed population is left with 163 million. This 163 million is the number of formerly employed people. So the employment rate as a percentage of the total urban working age labor force is 163 million divided by 409 million, that is about 30, and that is about 40%. Accordingly, the unemployment rate is a staggering 60%. However, in addition to formal employment, there is another form of employment in urban areas. It is called flexible employment. This includes delivering food, live streaming online, driving for ride-sharing services, providing domestic tutoring, and working as self-media creators, among other new forms of employment in the digital age. In Western countries, this status is known as self-employed, while in China, it's termed as flexible employment. So what is the number of people engaged in flexible employment in China? This figure was only announced once by the official agency during the 2021 press conference on the national economic operation. The head of the National Bureau of Statistics suddenly declared that the total number of people in flexible employment in China had reached 200 million. If we consider these 200 million people as fully employed, although some of them might have very low incomes and rely on family support to survive. But if we count them as employed, then the total number of employed people increases to 363 million. The number of unemployed people would then be 46 million. Based on this figure, the urban unemployment rate would be 11.2%. This is the urban unemployment rate calculated using the most lenient criteria. Among the 200 million so-called flexible employed, the largest group is live streamers, those who make videos on platforms like TikTok to earn money. In this regard, I suppose I'm also one of this kind. Just a joke. According to data disclosed at the 2021 live streaming and short video summit by the China Performance Industry by the China Performance Industry Association, the total number of various types of live streamers in China have reached an astonishing 130 million. The people you see in this video all belong to this group of people. They somehow all choose to do their live streaming at the same place. However, about 20% or 26 million of these streamers earn less than 2,000 yuan or about $279 per month. Note the word below here. Even zero income is considered below 2,000 yuan. This group could be classified as truly unemployed at any time. This means that with the economic downturn, as the live streaming industry becomes more competitive, these 26 million bottom-tier streamers could join the ranks of the unemployed at any time. This implies, This implies that the number of unemployed urban population could increase from 46 million to 72 million. If so, the urban unemployment rate would reach 17.6%. And an unemployment rate above 15% already signifies an economic crisis level. China's dual urban and rural system creates a huge gap between urban and rural hukou populations. There are fundamental differences in healthcare, pension, and education system, but there's one area where urban and rural residents are highly aligned. Neither have any employment security. In rural areas, nearly 300 million surplus population depend on nearly 300 million migrant workers working hard in cities and sending money home just to barely survive. While in the city, there are 200 million people in the so-called flexible employment and 46 million unemployed. These people have no stable source of income and could starve to death at any time. Lao Man believes that with the economic downturn, the number of 300 million migrant workers cannot possibly be maintained. Even if it's decreased by only 10% next year, 30 million migrant workers returning to their hometowns would correspond to 30 million surplus rural population, resulting in 60 million people facing starvation. Moreover, among the 200 million people in flexible urban employment, next year will see at least an additional 20 million unemployed, adding to the already 46 million unemployed, amounting to over 66 million people. So that's 60 million starving rural residents plus 66 million starving urban residents, a total of 126 million starving people. Such a dreadful situation is bound to become a reality by next year at the latest. Considering the current fiscal capabilities of the CCP, Lao Man says he can conclusively state the CCP has no ability to provide any relief for these 126 million starving people. And a person can starve to death in just 7 days without food and water. Therefore, by next year, Chinese society will face a situation where 126 million people could starve to death. What kind of horrifying scenario would that be? Lao Man believes that large-scale incidents of mutual harm among the lower classes will erupt explosively because all disasters that are logically deduced will inevitably occur in reality, and this time will be no exception. Well, this could be the dire situation if China's economy declines by 10%. And since all the unemployment figures are based on official data, I find them to be very solid and reliable. During his visit to the US, Xi Jinping unexpectedly stated that the CCP does not have plans to attack Taiwan in 2027 or 2035, claiming the world has misunderstood him. Judging from Xi Jinping's unexpectedly big smiles during his visit to the US, under pressure from China's economic downturn, he's begging the United States to ease up its stance on China. That's why he has temporarily given up the wolf-worried persona to reassume the role of the giant panda. However, a comment from an analysis struck me deeply. He said, with an army of over 100 million unemployed, if you don't let them fight against the US or Japan, they will turn around to fight against the CCP. So, how will the CCP resolve this inevitable surge of unemployment and the problem of 120 million starving people? This is indeed a very concerning issue that could also significantly impact the global landscape. Well, that's all for today. Please like, share, and comment on my videos. If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel or check if you are still subscribed, as YouTube keeps unsubscribing people for me. Also, you can visit my website at jenniferzhenblog.com, jenniferzhenblog.com for membership or donations to support my efforts. In these rapid changing times, I believe independent voices like mine are very important. Thank you. See you next time.